is I, Tentus Narraband Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on Vampire: The Eternal Struggle. I've been going over the various forgotten collectible card games. Card games that have fallen by the wayside and aren't played as much anymore. Maybe not even sold or produced any products anymore. And this is the third collectible card game that ever came out based upon the Vampire the Masquerade RPG set in the World of Darkness. When we last left off, we of course were talking about the minion phase, the largest and most important phase in your entire turn that we're going to talk about. Let's talk about combat. So combat occurs normally when one of your minions blocks the action of another minion. There of course are a number of cards which could call for combat, but these are very circumstantial based upon those actual cards. Whenever combat occurs, it is important to note that only ready minions participate in combat. That means any minion that is not ready is not participating in combat, and combat cannot ensue between two of them under your control. So you need one of your minions has to fight someone else's minions, have combat with them. Your own minions don't fight each other. But that's the important part of that, is the ready part. Because it doesn't actually matter if they're tapped or untapped. It's the fact that they were ready at the beginning of this action and endeavor. Because you have to remember, the acting minion will probably tap. It was ready, it's doing the action, you're blocking the action, causing combat, it will be tapped, but it was ready. So readiness is not based upon being tapped or untapped in the end in this case. Note it's also important that any minion cards that you play during combat are considered combat cards, unless those cards specifically say they are or are not combat cards. Now let's talk about the sequence of combat. Combat is made in a series of rounds. Each of these rounds has a number of steps. First you will determine range. It will determine the range of combat, which is either close range or long range. I'll explain that in a minute. Then you resolve the strikes that are made, the basically attacks against each other that are going to happen between these two minions. The final thing you're going to do is the press, where each minion has the option of pressing the attack and moving on to another round. This is also the point in time where combat may end, if this is the opportunity for it to occur. It is very important to note, of course, that the acting minion, the one that you blocked the action of, is the one that gets to, of course, go into combat first. Then the other minion, and gets the option of playing cards. Then the other one gets the option of playing cards for each of these steps. So effectively, the acting minion gets to choose first, the other minion participating in the combat second. Now let's talk about range some more, because it will be important to discuss this. So combat is fought at a range, which is either close range or long range. The difference between the two of these is how a strike may work. There are certain strikes which function at close range, certain strikes which function at long range, and others that could function at either range. Close range is the default that you're going to be going to out of the two of these. Now, a minion can use a maneuver to get to long range, or use a maneuver to get to close range. And it goes back and forth with both minions using maneuvers until a final maneuver is determined and no one wants to wish to alter the range the battle is at. It is important to note that changing range can only be done by the same minion one time in a row. It can't double this up because effectively it's canceling itself. There's no need to do that. So they'll go back and forth, and each minion will keep determining what the range is until they kind of either run out of abilities to maneuver, or they both reach a point in time which they are happy with the range about it. Any kind of card or effect that says before range are determined has to be determined before that acting player begins deciding whether they're going to change the range or not, any kind of choices of maneuvers. Before they even do that, that's when those cards are played. Now, a minion has no maneuvers by default. Cards and effects will give your minion maneuvers. Once your minion has a maneuver, they have to use it within the combat round in which they gain it. The more likely way that they're going to gain it is usually a strike will have a maneuver associated with that. It's basically you have to use that with that maneuver or lose it. The other thing about this that's important is when you do that, you're playing that maneuver with that strike card, and you're effectively announcing the strike that you're going to be using. You can't use a different strike if you're gaining a maneuver through a strike card. You've chosen it. You can't play another strike card or another type of attack or another type of weapon, because that's the other type of card which might give you a maneuver, is the type of weapon that the minion is using. So strikes, weapons will grant this, and as soon as you use a strike card that's an attack card, or a weapon card that's attached to your minion, you're basically choosing that, and you can't change that choice. You've locked yourself into, I'm using this, I have this maneuver associated with you. You can still get extra maneuvers from other cards, other modifiers, other effects, and then those could be used to, of course, cancel out your opponent's maneuvers if they're trying to change it. Now, just like with the strike card, the maneuver that you're getting instantaneously goes into effect pretty much once you're playing that strike card. Any kind of combat card, including any kind of combat modifier that gives a maneuver, you're choosing to use that when you play that combat card. You cannot have the option of not using it, unless specifically it states on the card that there's an optional maneuver as part of that card. It will say this maneuver is optional. Then I can play this modifier card or whatever card I'm playing, and I can choose not to make the maneuver. Otherwise, I'm forced into a corner, and I know what I have to do because the card basically told me, make a maneuver. Think of it this way. If you have an ability to attack at a range, and you're thinking that your enemy can only attack at close, you're going to want to be at long rather than at close, because then you can make your attack, and your opponent can't. Now let's talk about strikes, because next up, now that we've gotten our range, it's the declaration of strikes. Now, of course, in my attempt to maneuver to the range, I might have already played my strike card. I might not have. I might be playing my card now, and it's going to be this strike versus strike that's going to be occurring. Now, it is important to note that not all strikes are offensive. You can have defensive strikes. Anything that kind of entitles dodging, ducking, gaining cover, usually is also considered a strike. It's effectively, I'm making a defensive move rather than an offensive move. Both are strikes. Normally, a minion only gets one strike a turn, though there are some cards and effects which can grant a minion additional strikes. Whenever you are resolving strikes, you resolve them in pairs, regardless of how many you end up getting. This could result that one minion could have may have a pair of strikes, and the other minion could just have that single one normal strike you get. It's resolved in the same way. That individual strike is resolved the same way a pair would if your opponent also does have a pair. During each of these pairs of strikes, the minion will choose which strike will act first, and of course the acting minion gets to choose their strike first. Then the other minion gets to choose their strike. These two strikes resolve simultaneously. Then you move on to the next part of that pair. Then you move on to the next set of pairs, etc., like that. So we are breaking them down, and there are matters that could deal with the fact that you've paired these two strikes together, but effectively I do the first one, then I do the second one, and I choose as the acting one this one, they choose this one, same time resolve. Unless there's something that says these two strikes resolve at a different point in time, it's always at the same time. Though again, like everything else, there could be a card that specifically says, maybe this strike happens first. So, that's it for today. I talked about combat. Now, I haven't finished discussing combat when it comes to, of course, Vampire the Eternal Struggle, but I dove into the very basics of it, and I started explaining it all to you. Now, there are 3 major steps to every round of combat, and it goes round after round after round until one side stops fighting it, or one side doesn't push the battle, and the battle ends with no one pushing it. Of course, I talked about the first one, which is determining the range you're going to fight at, close or long range. And the strike or weapon you're using, well, it might be only usable at one of those. So maneuvering into a position where you can use a weapon and your opponent can't, or you can use a strike and your opponent can't, is what you kind of want to do to start out with. Then there's strikes, the actual hits against each other, which normally you only get one. But there are possibilities that you could get more than one, and they just pair off, and that's what they do. In the next episode, I'm going to dive into strikes a little bit more, and then I'm going to move on to the last part, pushing the combat. We're going to try to finish up at least combat in the next episode. But if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, And subscribe. It shows support for the channel, the empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you could always check out my Patreon. Link in the description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.